The bombing of Serbia was not undertaken out of concern for the plight of the Kosovar Albanians, which incidentally we know from masses of documentation about what was going on.
And you'll take a look at John Norris's book, and what he says is the real purpose of the war had nothing to do with concern for Kosovar Albanians.
I mean, there are new issues coming up, like what to do about Kosovo, for example. It's a new issue. Well, you know, I can tell you my own opinion, but I don't know what their planning is, they haven't said. But I think a not unreasonable answer is one that was proposed by the president of Serbia in, I think, 1993. Kosic, I think his name was.
Ky është Noam Chomsky dhe këto që dëgjuat janë vetëm disa nga mendimet kontroverse të tij. Deklarata si kjo e fundit, lingvistin, filozofin dhe teoricianin amerikan e kanë bërë vështirë të përtypshëm në Kosovë. Duke qenë një kritik i çelëkt i politikës jashtme amerikane për pothuajse një jetë të tërë, opinioni kosovar nuk i ka mirëpritur pikpamjet e tij ndër vite. Ndonse shumë i lexuar brenda çarsheve akademike dhe i njohur për mendimtar të Zotin, kritika e tij ndaj intervenimit të NATO-s në Kosovë është ballafaqur me rezistencë të pakompromisshme. Deklaratat për bombardimet e NATO-s dhe në përgjithësi politikën perëndimore që Chomsky e redukton në amerikane, të shqiptarët në përgjithësi është pozicionuar deri diku edhe shabllon si anti-amerikan dhe pro-serb. Megjithë këtë, Noam Chomsky në një intervistë për Albanian Post, intervista e tij e parë për një medie shqiptare, shpjegon se kurrë nuk ka qenë kundër pavarësisë Kosovës. Ai në fakt thotë se ka menduar qysh atëherë se një Kosovë e pavarur ka qenë ide e mirë.
I would like to start this interview by asking you to clarify a long confusion that exists, especially in the widespread opinion of Kosovo Albanians concerning your critiques mostly of US foreign policy over the years. It is automatically taken to mean that you were against Kosovo having its own political institution and independence. Although you've spoken of the unspeakable crimes of the then regime, Milosevic, the Albanian public hasn't been able to warmly welcome your views, although you are read and cherished in the academic circles. How do you see now Kosovo as a state recognized by half of the world?
First of all, I was not opposed to Kosovo independence. I thought it was a good idea. What I was opposed to was the NATO war, which radically escalated the atrocities in Kosovo exactly as was anticipated. If you look at the Kosovo situation in 1998, 1999, we know a great deal about it because Kosovo was saturated with OSCE observers who wrote detailed reports about what was happening. There was a regular level of crimes. What was happening was that KLA guerrillas from Albania were entering Kosovo, killing many people. There were Serb responses, which were bitter, brutal, and vicious, killing more people. In fact, the heads of the KLA guerrillas stated explicitly that their goal was to elicit Serb responses. So maybe sooner or later there'd be a NATO response. Well, this was going on until March 1999. In March, there were discussions, Rambouillet discussions. There were several proposals on the table. Serbian KLA, there was room for negotiation between them. The United States decided to invade, knowing with confidence that would sharply increase atrocities. General Clark, William Clark, the NATO commander, meaning US commander, informed Washington before the invasion that if there was an invasion, it would sharply increase casualties on the ground. He informed the press the day before the invasion that there are going to be a sharp increase in casualties. Yes, that happened. US started bombing. Serbs reacted on the ground as predicted. Huge atrocities went on for 78 days. Finally, there was an agreement. The agreement was a compromise between what was on the table in March. So the effect of the US refusal for negotiations was to kill lots of Kosovars, knowing that that's exactly what would happen. And then came the agreements. You can like them or dislike them, but the slaughter was unnecessary. It was the result, the anticipated result of the NATO invasion. That's what I opposed. Kosovo should be, its political status should be determined by its population. Overwhelmingly, they've wanted independence, so fine, independence.
Kosova ka shpallur pavarësinë në vitin 2008. Është e njohur nga 117 shtete demokratike dhe anëtarësua në organizata të shumta ndërkombëtare. Por Chomsky, kur pyetet rreth zgjidhjes përfundimtare mes Kosovës e Serbisë, ngjan jo fort I përditësuar. Në vijat e përgjithshme, Kosovën e pavarur e njeh si fakt të kryer, por për pjesën e serbëve brenda shtetit ka propozimin e një forme të autonomisë.
There should be an accommodation within Kosovo between the majority, basically Albanian population, and the minority Serb population in one corner of Kosovo. Could move towards some kind of accommodation in a federal arrangement with a degree of autonomy for the Serbian regions. I think that's what should happen. Well, that requires, again, the same two factors. First of all, on the ground, there has to be an agreement. Kosovars and the Serbs in Kosovo have to come to an accommodation. As you say, that's not happening. We can't do anything about that. What we can do is see that if our own countries can move towards facilitating this accommodation. So Albania has a great deal of influence, of course, in Kosovo. Russia has a great deal of influence in Serbia. The United States, of course, is the dominant world power. It has enormous influence over everything. So the outside powers could move towards trying to facilitate an agreement on the ground. Unfortunately, that's not happening, and it's not going to happen as long as the Ukrainian war is not settled. Unfortunately, that's reality.
Për dialogun mes Kosovës dhe Serbisë, Chomsky s'ka shumë për të thënë. Përveç se, sipas tij, lufta në Ukrainë ka zhvendosur vëmendjen e perëndimit dhe aktualisht s'ka fort interes për çështje tjera.
There's two elements to this. One is what's happening internally between Kosovo and the Serbs. That's one question. The other question is, can the international community take a constructive attitude towards it? If you look at the settlement of conflicts in the region and elsewhere, they've usually proceeded when the great powers entered and agreed to some kind of accommodation. Well, right now, with the war going on in Ukraine, it's almost beyond imagination that Russia and the United States will enter into serious discussions and about how to resolve the Kosovo issue.
Sa për Rusinë dhe pozicionin karshi Kosovës, Chomsky nuk e sheh si opsion ndryshimin e çështjes së Putinit. Përkundër referencave të tij me Kosovën dhe argumentin se situata është e njëjtë edhe me republikat separatiste të Donbasit.
I've seen no indication of any change in Russian policy. And in the context of this military confrontation, I doubt very much that there will be a change. If peace can be brought to Ukraine and an accommodation can be facilitated in the region, then possibly Russia's position might change. But under the current conditions, I doubt it very much.
Prej se ka filluar lufta në Ukrainë, për shkak të lidhjeve të Rusisë me Republika Srpska në Bosnjë dhe qeverinë serbe, vazhdimisht ka pasur skenar hipotetik se rrezikohet një shpërthim edhe në Ballkan, veçanërisht në Bosnjë e Kosovë.
Do you consider that such a scenario can happen in Kosovo and in Bosnia?
Could happen, but there's no sign of it. There's a lot of rotten things happening in the Serbian-run regions of Bosnia, the Bosnian Serb Republic. There's a lot of rotten things happening in the Croatian areas. They're not so far influencing in any way the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Western reaction to it. And it's unlikely that they would. They're too peripheral.
Për atë, çfarë po ndodh në Ukrainë, siç dihet, Chomsky ka mendim të parafort me John Mearsheimer. Sipas tij, SBA-ja I kaloi vijat e kuq. Chomsky me këtë politikë të perëndimit nuk e justifikon agresionin rus, megjithatë e jep ato si aset për të shpjeguar politikën agresive të Putinit.
This was actually done 20 years ago, early 2000s. There was international intervention, including Russia, France, Germany, United States, on laying out a program for the region. The U.S. Delegate John Quigley has just written about what happened. You can look it up. There were sensible proposals. They collapsed. Mostly they were about Ukraine. The proposals would have led to a federalized Ukraine within the framework of the Minsk II agreement that was initiated by France and Germany, which would grant a degree of autonomy to the Donbass region within Ukrainian Federation. There were also provisions for Crimea, where the large majority of the population wanted to be accommodated with Russia. Those proposals were made in the early 2000s with great power participation. Fell apart. We can talk about how they fell apart, but there was a major U.S. role in undermining them. It took place primarily in 2014, when the Maidan uprising took place throughout the Russian-oriented government, moved towards the West. At that point, NATO, meaning the United States, started programs in Ukraine to lead to de facto integration of Ukraine within the NATO military alliance. This is not secret. It's perfectly public. You can read the statements by Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO, not only reporting this, but praising it, saying, yes, we began to pour weapons into Ukraine. We began joint military operations, training of Ukrainian military officers. Yes, we did this starting in 2014, crossing what everyone knew to be a Russian red line long before Putin. Back in the 1990s, Yeltsin, others made it clear that Russia would not respond to Clinton's violation of the pledge not to move NATO to the east. Russia didn't like it, but wouldn't respond to it. But there were red lines. The red lines were Ukraine and Georgia, well understood. CIA directors, high US diplomats. Everyone understood it. Clinton violated it. George W. Bush, the second Bush. Actually, what happened is kind of interesting. In 2019, Zelensky was elected with an overwhelming mandate, 70%, a mandate for peace. He's a courageous man. He began to make moves to the Donbass region to see if they could move towards implementing something like the Minsk II agreement. He was threatened with death by the right-wing Ukrainian militias. They said, if you proceed with this, we'll kill you. Well, the US refused to give him any backing. If he had had any US support, he might have been able to proceed. But the US had a different plan. The plan was to move forward with the integration of Ukraine into the US NATO command. So Zelensky had to back off. Well, we can pretend that these things didn't happen if we like, but they did. And they're part of the background for the criminal aggression. Again, they don't justify it, of course, but they help explain it.
Ky lloj argumentimi I Chomskyt është edhe arsyeja pse ai kritikohet shumë. Përkundërse argumentativ, tendenca I tij për të fajsuar më shumë Shtetet e Bashkuara të Amerikës sepse donin integrim të Ukrainës në NATO, sesa vetë invazionin rus, është shumë problematike edhe për shumë kë nonsens. Por ky është Chomsky, kontrovers dhe diskutabil, megjithatë konsistent në qëndrime. Shpjegimet e tij nuk janë përçafuar gjithësisht asnjëherë, por as nuk janë përjashtuar krejtësisht.
Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky. I should not like to take any more of your time, but thanks so much for sparing
Thank you.
your time to talk with us.
Pleasure to be with you.